Hello, and welcome to our live discussion today on military veteran suicide prevention. My name is Cherie Tham. I'm the co-founder and vice president of programs and initiatives at America's Warrior Partnership. Our mission at America's Warrior Partnership is to empower communities to empower veterans. And one of the most critical issues we're working with communities to overcome right now is veteran premorbidity through suicide, asphyxiation, high-speed single driver accident, drowning, overdose, suicide by law enforcement, and accidental gunshot. We were able to accomplish this through Operation Deep Dive. Operation Deep Dive is a community-based veteran suicide prevention study taking place in 14 states across the country. It is led by our team at America's Warrior Partnership and researchers from the University of Alabama, with the generous support from Bristol Myers Squibb Foundation. As our research continues, we plan to use these Facebook Live videos as a way to continue to inform you of the latest information and offer practical solutions that can be used in your communities to unite with us on an upstream approach to veteran suicide. For our first video, I'm honored to welcome Dr. Eric Kane of the University of Rochester Medical Center. Dr. Kane is a well-respected clinical psychiatrist and suicidologist. He is one of the lead experts evaluating the data for Operation Deep Dive. We'll be having a conversation around upstream approaches to public health and the latest information on socio-ecological approaches that communities can use to prevent veteran suicide. At the end of our conversation, we'll wrap up with information about what you can do to join us in combating veteran suicide and non-natural deaths within your own community. So with great pleasure, I'd like to welcome Dr. Eric Kane. Dr. Kane, would you please take a moment to introduce yourself?
Oh, sure. Thank you. And greetings from Rochester, New York, and my kitchen. We're all doing virtual work these days. It's really been an honor to work with Cherie and her colleagues from Operation Deep Dive. Let me put myself into some perspective so you at least know where I'm coming from when I talk about suicide. So I worked for many years, actually as an inpatient psychiatrist, taking care of folks with serious mental disorders and lots of people who had made serious suicide attempts. But in the 1980s, started working with colleagues to really study suicide more. And we began to work doing what are called psychological autopsies with a medical examiner trying to understand what was happening during the days, weeks, and months before somebody died. We went into this thinking that indeed what we needed to do was to get folks into mental health care. What we realized within a few years was, well, that's not a bad idea, of course. Many people will never come to see mental health providers. Many people will die before we ever get to interact with them. And indeed, they live in communities and among their families where they may be in distress, but at the time, they're not suicidal. And so we started to think about how could we make a difference in their lives long before they came to the point of thinking that it was time to die.
So I hear, or we hear in this area, this term or this phrase called upstream approach. Can you help unpick that a little bit around what does that mean exactly around suicide prevention?
Well, you know, it's really important to think about suicide prevention, like prevention of other diseases and other conditions, in several different ways. So let me back up and talk about heart disease for a minute, because that's pretty common. Now, obviously, if you have a heart attack, here I am grabbing my chest, I don't know if you can see that, and they take me to the emergency room, they may obviously, try to find out whether one of my arteries is clogged. They might put in a stent and do something acutely. But we do heart disease prevention now by years and years before, helping someone stop smoking, helping people, for instance, if they have a little high blood pressure, it doesn't have to be very high, but lower their blood pressure, help them reduce their triglycerides. And all of this is before things have come to really developing severe heart disease. That's upstream. Downstream, or at the moment, is when someone has a heart attack. Now, in the mental health field where I come from, most of the suicide work has been focused on finding someone who is suicidal, thinking about killing himself, planning how to kill herself, whatever, but clearly on the edge or near the edge of, I sometimes call it the edge of the cliff or the edge of the ledge. But really what we want to do is find ways of identifying people in communities during their lives long before they come to the edge of the ledge. Because we know that from a prevention point of view, it's at that time that people have what we would call risks, high risks, things that might increase the probability: family problems, drinking, substance use problems, mental health problems, employment problems. Maybe they were abused as kids and had many adverse childhood experiences, but they're vulnerable. And what we want to do is begin to think about, how do we engage folks when they're vulnerable, when life may be a mess, but not necessarily when they're at the edge of the ledge.
There's that quote. I've heard you say that often. I think it's a great quote. So if we look at, I mean, you've done a lot of research around socio-ecological approaches around suicide, and that is a very scientific term for me and maybe our viewers. Can you help us to understand the basic overall implementation of that model and how that can be leveraged to support the upstream approach?
So let me talk about this jargon word, socio-ecological. You know, we use it in the literature, in the public health literature, in the medical literature, but it really makes sense in other ways. If you think of it, let's think about a community, and we'll think about people's lives. But if you think about a community, there are all sorts of places in a community where we encounter people. Mm-hmm. It could be at the grocery store. It could be at court if someone had a driving while intoxicated, or where there's a problem with family violence. It could be parents in schools where there's a kid in trouble. It could be any number of places, employment. For some veterans, of course, it's the Veterans Health Administration, or it could be VSOs. There are any number of places where we come into contact with people. And I sort of think of that as kind of a geography of a community. Mm-hmm. We also can say, well, how do we track the lives of people? Well, each person has their own kind of personal ecology, where you could track them around and you know, I could say, well, how do you, Sherry, live your life? You know, where do you go? Who do you come into contact with? And it's really a putting together of an understanding of where the path, maybe, that we could say, that someone follows in living their life, and the places they go. And we're actually trying to think of, where might we encounter a veteran who's in distress, or veterans where, as I say, life's a mess. You know, that's a really technical medical term, life's a mess. We don't have to know what their diagnosis is to know that things are trouble. You know, it could be at work and somebody's boss says, you know, you're not showing up as much. It could be at home or at church, or any number of places where we see that people are in distress. Now, we tend not to intervene, right? We tend to hold back and say, well, that's their private business. But for some of us, suicide's a public health problem. And as a public health problem, we know that every suicide affects 100 people. You know, in the old days, they used to say it affected 6 or 7, but more recent research out of the University of Kentucky, for example, found that we're 135 people affected by a person's suicide, when you consider who knows about it, the kids and their friends and families and church and, you know, other organizations or employment places. So suicide has all these ripple effects across the public. And we know that we want to help people. You know, it's part of standing together.
Right. And, you know, you're talking kind of like on an individual level about, you know, one death and this is how many people are affected. And I think also looking at it from, you know, one death in the fabric of a community. I mean, that is where I think you're talking about that ripple effect, and it really affects the community as a whole. As well as the individuals that were in the inner circle, if you will, of the one that what they
exactly lost. And then we can actually start thinking about communities within a community, because of course a community is not a, you know, you could take a city or a town or a you know, whatever kind of space you want to describe, but of course there are older veterans, and there are younger veterans, and there are men and there are women, and none of their lives are, you know, with a rare exception, lived in total isolation. You know, they're interwoven with their families, with their social circles and with people around them, and of course in the broader community fabric. And so each of these lives, these losses, really is a path unto death.
Right.
And this kind of path unto death we can think of it in two ways. One is that, of course, for some people, there's a lot of trouble on the path. So we might think of a situation where, I'll use this as an example. Someone's now out of the service. He's had a hard time readjusting. He starts to drink too much. There's family abuse. Well, the kids are victims as much as the wife, and also as much as the veteran, because the veteran's also suffering from distress, depression, substance use, and other things. And so we want to intervene to make a difference in their lives, all of them. And we understand that a veteran, for example, where the family, say the wife has to get an order of protection. Now that's an opportunity to intervention, but it's also a time of threat, because when a veteran is isolated, that social support of the family, however maladaptive it might have been, is his only support. And suddenly he's alone and he's isolated. And we see suicide in that context a lot. So we want to be able to use something like, I'm using that example because the courts, for example, can be a wonderful place. Not that we think of courts as wonderful, but very effective place where you support the family and you support the veteran. And you try to make a difference in his or her life, but and it's really takes a collaboration, because if you think of it, then it may be community social service agencies, the court officials, the law enforcement, probation, it may be mental health providers, primary care. And one of the really fundamental things is finding a way to bring these folks together. And of course, that's one of the missions of AWP, is to find a way of bringing people together. And for Deep Dive, obviously, what we're trying to do is put a better light, a bright light for you, if, for example, on this path unto death, so that we can see this and say, well, what would we needed to have done if someone had shown up in court, or someone shows up in an alcohol rehab center? What would we needed to have done at that moment, or a homeless shelter? So there are lots of opportunities, but we don't think of that typically as suicide prevention. And one of the things that we're saying is upstream, to be important, doesn't have to have the big S on it. It doesn't have to be called suicide prevention. It can be called helping people make their lives better.
Yeah, I mean, you're touching on a lot of our viewers and other VSOs. They might be concentrated on one thing, housing the homeless or employing the unemployed, and what I hear you saying is that within specialities, all of those specialities combined equals the outcome of an upstream approach to veteran suicide and non-natural cause death.
So one of the terms that I've used for a long time is comprehensive and integrated. So when we think about people, we want to have efforts that are not piecemeal. You need that fabric. You need the pieces because, well, let's take a detox program. A detox program may be very good to help someone get off of alcohol or drugs, but that's not enough if someone also at that point has, frayed the family fabric. If someone's also just, his boss got fed up and said, I can't do this anymore. In the same way that when someone goes to primary care and is, say, in his 60s and he's got chronic pain, and he's getting discouraged and he's withdrawn from his friends, from interacting. Well, at that time, you may need to pull the whole family together and say, hey, what are we going to do? He's withdrawn, he's isolated. This may be the kids, the grandkids. How do we cluster around and then say, well, but he used to go for coffee every Thursday with his friends. Now he doesn't go. He's having a hard time driving or something. Well, how can we arrange to have one of his friends pick him up? How can we arrange from somebody at the church to look out for him? How can we arrange to make sure that he's not lost? And we see this, say, when a wife dies or a husband dies, and someone's more isolated, and folks kind of sometimes forget about that person. And
it's scary, isn't it? I mean, it's scary to see someone that you love changing, like that. And I think, and this is going to kind of lead nicely into the next question that I had is, what are some of the obstacles like that communities may face, and how do you think they can overcome them?
Well, there are a complex set of barriers, and some of the barriers are within people. And let's just face it. I make fun of old white men. Since I'm in the category of old white men, I can make fun of them. And think of it. How many older white men are really open with their feelings? Really tell people what's in their heart, and really say, "I need your help." Well, a lot of people have a lot of pride. I mean, I have a lot of pride. A lot of us think, well, we're in control, we're accomplished. So one set of barriers is this notion of reaching out and saying, "Hey, I'm really here, and let's do something." Years ago, I reviewed a bunch of medical records of basically old white men who had died by suicide, and they had seen their docs within the last month. Well, when their doc said, "How are you?" "Fine." Now, we started to train doctors not to say, "How are you?" but, "Well, gee, I understand that, you've had a lot of pain, and how has that affected your life?" And it gets into the real fabric and substance. So being able to engage somebody is the first level, and not being shy about that. A second level is, well, who's responsible? And of course, in our country, we often think of individual responsibility. It's my job. But one of the things that we're saying about suicide prevention, and we talk about communities, and we talk about interventions, is a sense of collective responsibility. The idea that we help to take care of each other. And this is a real barrier, because some people don't buy into that. But we know around the world that when we've looked at countries that have been successful at radically reducing suicide, it's built in part on the idea of that generosity of spirit. Now, we know that exists in many places. Some people, they disappear from church, and there's always somebody saying, "Where is he?" or "Where is she?" And so social connection is really important. And if it doesn't exist, it's how to make it. Then, of course, there are all these different agencies, and they say, "Well, it's my responsibility to help somebody with his drinking, but not with his depression." One of the things you talk about with some detox programs or others, "Well, I'm here for drinking, but I'm not here for depression or suicide." That's out of my area, and people get real scared about that. Mm-hmm. Or the courts will say, "Well, I'm here for law enforcement," but we know that there's a whole movement across the United States called therapeutic justice. And therapeutic justice involves drug courts, veteran courts, mental health courts. The idea being that courts encounter people in great distress. Some employers, obviously see their workers as very valuable. But we know that other employers think, "Meh, he's my worker, and if he disappears, I can get somebody else," which of course isn't always true. So part of what we're trying to do in this, and part of where AWP and other VSOs are so important, is the notion of building coalitions. Mm-hmm. The notion of building collaborative efforts to bring together all the diverse skills that each of the programs has, each of the areas has. And of course, again, everybody thinks I've got the special program, but one of the things that I've always said is, yeah, but not everybody has everything for everybody. Not every program has all things that all people need.
Right. Which is why it's so important for, breaking down barriers, for silos within your community, that it's one team, one fight, that everyone's working together towards a common mission. That's the secret sauce, right? Or, that's what we believe to be the secret sauce. And I think through Operation Deep Dive and the research that we're doing, but also as Operation Deep Dive is more than just research, right? It's taking research and putting it into a programmatic format for communities to be able to make those linkages, to embrace the community they're in, and to be able to support the vulnerable, populations within their communities.
Well, if you think about research in a sort of a broader way, it isn't just about developing new knowledge. Of course, that's part of it. But it's also about developing lessons that teach us how to do differently.
Great.
It's about how to make a difference in people's lives. Some of us went into medicine, for example, to make a difference in people's lives. So the research is really, how do I do that better? How do I do it more effectively? And so, we know that it's actually kind of hard to get communities to work together. People tend to look out for themselves. Organizations look out for their well-being. There's a sense of competition as well as collaboration. But, it's kind of like when I've made this point in medicine, I'm going to step away from our usual thing. So I led a department of psychiatry for many years. I had a hard time getting the Department of Medicine to do primary care for our people with severe mental disorders. And I finally said, we're going to set up a primary care medicine service. And this was in 1993. And we've run primary care medicine because we know that traditional psychiatry departments don't offer everything that people need. Now, eventually the Department of Medicine came around and others came around and said, well, this is kind of a good idea. But the notion is that you have to build things that meet people's needs that may go beyond what you happen to offer. We have to reshape ourselves, and collaboration is one of the most effective ways of doing that. Now, it's hard to do, and so let's be really frank about it. When you take veterans, of course, the VA, the Veterans Department of Veterans Affairs, has worked really hard to prevent suicide. But if we look over the last 20 years, suicide rates among veterans in the general community have gone up just the way they have in the general population. But we know that veteran suicide rates are about 1.5 times that of the general population. When you adjust for age and the composition of mostly men, it's still much higher. And so we're faced with a challenge of saying, well, the VA's worked really hard, VSOs have worked really hard, but somehow we haven't really cracked this nut the way we want to. And so we need to really look at ourselves and say, again, what do we need to do in a different fashion? There have been some successful upstream programs. I mean, the biggest one was in the US Air Force between 1996 and 2007. And that was a really multi-layered community program, brought all the elements of the community together and really had some very measurable success. Colleagues and I looked at this, very measurable success, really turning down the suicide rates. Now, eventually it stopped. And the Air Force, as the other active duty services, have really struggled to bring it back because of all the really heavy activity that's gone on since, after 9/11, where, our military is stretched really thin. And so it's been hard to keep that community cohesion in a way that was so important and so central to what they did. Now, we've seen some programs in schools. We've seen some programs with elders. So there are elements out there, but it's really the challenge now to bring this to veterans.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned the VA, and a lot of times we think of the VA, as they're a large organization, but the VA is based in our communities, right? And so for our viewers, the VA is in your community, is as much a partner as Dr. Kane is talking about the court systems, is talking about the housing programs, the employment programs, so it's and Operation Deep Dive will bring it back to it on a community level, and you're looking at those community organizations, and you want to diversify the community organizations that are all working together in order to get to what Dr. Kane was talking about knowing the whole of the person and not just right. The one immediate need of them.
Well, and
we're running out of time. Okay.
Well, just to make a couple of things. So we learned, going back to our psychological autopsy studies, that people don't come to the health provider or the mental health provider often when they're suicidal. They often avoid us at those times because they really are suicidal.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things to understand is, you have the VHA, which has not the whole of all the veterans, but less than half. But even when they're caring for people, most of the people who die by suicide die in their communities,
Mm-hmm.
die outside the view of the VA. It's the communities that have the potential to engage people on this path. So that's really the point of why I brought up the VA, because while they're champions, we need to bring together the communities to be champions alongside and understand that actually the community is larger.
Oh yeah, and absolutely. And to your point about what you were talking about, psychiatry and then bringing on general medicine or whatever, I was meaning, or I was thinking more in terms of physical health, and so like and outside the mental health and the physical health providers, our GPs that we go to see, if they start noticing physical things, right, then where did they go with that information? How do we arm them? How as a community do we embrace that the first door may be a consequence of a physical change that's occurring and bringing that in, and so it's just an encouragement of the physical health community.
Absolutely.
As well.
And general medicine sees more people, sees more people more often. And moreover, people are often willing to share with their primary care provider things that they wouldn't share with other people.
Right.
And how to link that again, how to build coalitions between VSOs, community organizations, primary care is one of the challenges that we face.
So let's, I think we might have time for a few questions, but let's talk to our viewers a little bit about how they can help us with Operation Deep Dive. And how you can do that is we are conducting Operation Deep Dive across the United States in 14 different states across the United States. I just said that. And we are doing a retrospective piece that we're looking at those who have died by suicide and non-natural causes. We're also doing a prospective piece. And what that means is what we're doing is the help that we need from you is if you know a loved one who has died by suicide or non-natural cause deaths that I mentioned when we started the Facebook Live, and they've died within the last 24 months, we would like to conduct an interview with family members, friends, coworkers around that individual. What the interview that we conduct is very similar to what Dr. Kane described initially around the psychological autopsy, but we've added into it a little more of the community factor. Where were the community touch points? Where were places that we could have met that veteran before, as Dr. Kane says, they were in a mess? You don't say it exactly like that, but before they got into that overall crisis period to build up. So that brings us back to the upstream approach. For more information on finding out about Operation Deep Dive and how you can participate, please feel free to go to our website. It's americaswarriorpartnership.org/deep dive. And we have information on there, and you can obviously contact us for more information. Now, I am going to look at and see if do we have any questions? Some basic comments. All right. So Eric, I'm going to share some basic comments, and yeah, we might want to so the comments are when we got through the collaboration. Wait, it's moving. Okay. Okay, so happy to be here. Excited about the interview with you, Dr. Kane. Prevention of premature deaths from self-injury, suicide, drug deaths, and alcohol and risk-related diseases must form a mosaic built within the context of community settings and the social ecology of populations and of individuals as well as families. Effective prevention will involve multiple complementary components. This mosaic cannot be built or effectively sustained outside the domain of people's lives.
Yeah, I've heard that before.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
So,
Lots of thank yous. Um, Very interesting fact about how many individuals are affected when they're talking, about the loss of a loved one. Um,
that's the work of Julie Searle, Cerel. If anybody wants to look up her work, Julie is actually was trained in Rochester, New York, as part of our training program years ago, and is in Louisville, and is really a major leader in the field and working with families, but also working with survivors. And I think it's worthwhile to think about her work.
Absolutely. Got a lot of likes about complex set of barriers. I think we could all agree we could do probably a week, 40 hours just on the complexity of barriers. So yes, echoing that as well. Um, Thank yous, getting involved in our local community, one team, one fight.
So as you're going through that, I want to sort of emphasize that, when we talk about community collaboration, there's no one perfect formula because communities are so different one from another. And so this really takes a lot of local leadership. And you have an organization, for example, like the VA. And of course, the VA is very committed, but they don't know all about each of the different communities. And so one of the things that we really want to emphasize is how this is a partnered process. I might be a so-called expert or, leader in something or other. I don't remember what you said at the beginning, but that doesn't help me help you in a particular community, because you know about the community and the barriers, and you know about the opportunities, and you know which strings to pull or which things you need to deal with. So I really encourage a sense of community ownership and activism in this. This is critical to the long-term success. And as much as, there are many experts around, I'm putting those in quotes now, it's important to realize that you're the experts in your communities about what are some of the drivers there and how to engage and encourage people to come together. And, I can say it's really important to collaborate, but I can't, I can think about Rochester, New York, for example, but I wouldn't necessarily know about other places in the country. So I really advocate for local leadership and local drive in a collaborative way with people who may have other kinds of expertise.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you all for your support and for tuning in today to listen to Dr. Kane and myself discuss Operation Deep Dive. Please stay tuned to America's Warrior Partnership Facebook page for information on future Operation Deep Dive live discussions. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you, Dr. Kane.
Bye-bye now.